Right, in this full UI5 course, you are going to learn everything you need to know to get started with data binding. And if you are new to UI5, then I would highly recommend you take a look at my channel here and take a look at the video called Learn SAP UI5 in 5 hours. Here is a full walkthrough based on the SAP UI5 documentation walkthrough, which will help anyone who's a beginner get to grips with the basic concepts in UI5. So if you're new to UI5, data binding can be a bit complex, and some of the topics we'll talk about will get into quite a bit of detail. If you have no knowledge of UI5, I would highly recommend you take a look at this course. We'll be looking at data binding, as I said, in quite a bit of detail, and we'll run through important topics like aggregation binding, formatters, data types, and things like expression binding, which I am a particularly big fan of. So pretty much all the tools that you'll need to build the best possible UI5 applications. We are going to follow the UI5 walkthrough under data binding, and we're going to run through all 15 steps here, and I'm going to take you through them in detail as we go along. As we complete each step, I will have it referenced in a commit inside my Git repository, so that you can come here and pull the code exactly as I've written it and as exactly how it's been recorded on the video, and you can start from any step that you want. So if you decide you want to start from step 10, you just jump into step 10, and you can browse the files, and you can simply download the code and go from there if you want. And we will eventually come out with an application that looks like this, and obviously there's a whole bunch of functionality that we'll have that you can use in your day-to-day projects. I'm going to be running through the examples from my local machine using Visual Studio Code, so your project will eventually come out and look like this. To run and test the examples, I'll be using the UI5 CLI and Node.js, which is how we will run our local server on our local machine. You can follow along on your local machine and your local web ID, your local IDE of choice, or you can use something like the SAP Web IDE. It's completely up to you. One final thing is, in all of my courses, I purposely make many mistakes, and you'll see me in many examples pull up the Chrome console to try and debug and figure out what's gone wrong. Those mistakes, or at least most of them, are there on purpose to just add an extra layer of sort of learning to help you guys see and understand how another developer might look at or approach a problem. You might do it better, or you might learn something. That's the best part. It's all about learning by doing. So I've left those mistakes in there. So again, as well, if you wind up making a ton of mistakes, that is the purpose of learning, and hopefully we can learn together. So yeah, let's jump right in. Right, so before we get started, we need to set up our application structure. And to do that, we are going to start with the UI5 CLI. And the first thing we're going to do is run npm init and run yes with all the options. And that gives us our package.json file, which is all good and well. Now we need to run, now we need to create our UI5.yaml file using the command UI5 init. And I forgot to create the web app folder first, so we need to add our web app folder here, and then we can run this UI5 init again. Brilliant, there's our UI5.yaml file. Now what we need to do is we need to create our manifest.json file, and that should go inside the web app folder itself. And I'll have a link to this in the description for a sort of the subset of information that you need just to get started. I'm just going to copy it across from the documentation. Brilliant. So that's just a bit of boilerplate stuff we have in our manifest. We can go ahead and save that. And the last thing we need to do is we need to tell SAP, the SAP UI5, we need to tell the app which UI5 library we want to use. So we are going to again use the CLI, and we're going to say UI5 use SAP UI5 because we want to use the SAP UI5 library specifically, and we want the latest version, and let that run. Brilliant. So now we can get started with step 1. Right, now in step 1 we are going to set up a basic HTML page with an index.js file to go along with it, and we're going to use that to display a hard-coded text control, which will form the base of what we're doing with absolutely no data binding yet. So let's go ahead and create a new index.html file underneath our web app folder. And under there, I'm just going to copy across the HTML directly from the SAP documentation. The only thing we need to do is just change the source. And the source is going to come from the Open UI5 Content Delivery Network. And that's just going to allow us to pull all of our data from there, all the SAP UI5 libraries and controls, etc. And because this is just a demo slash tutorial or course, we're just going to use this for now. You wouldn't normally use this with your production apps for performance reasons and all of that. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and save. And now let's go ahead and create the hard-coded text control in our index.js file. So let's create index.js, and let's open up our require sap.ui.require, and let's pull in our SAP/m/text control from the sap.m library. And once we have that, we can go ahead and open up our function, passing in that text control, or that text part of the library, and then we can go ahead and run our function. So first thing I'm going to do is put use strict to run the strict check and control over our JavaScript. And now what we're going to do is we're going to attach an anonymous function to the SAP UI5 init event. And to do that, we're going to use sap.ui.getCall. Now, it's important to note with this that when you use this, you attach and use the items directly on the core itself, which is not obviously how you would do your production apps. When you run your production apps, for example, you would run something like this.getView.set or getModel, etc., etc. And so this is view specific, running off the context, which is what this sort of is. The other reason we're using sap.ui.getCall is because the documentation that we are using as the backbone for this course uses this. And I think it's just to illustrate the point and to focus rather on the actual models and how to create them and use them, etc., etc., and data binding itself. So just bear in mind that you'll see ui.getCall throughout the course. Don't use this in your production apps, rather focus on your view specific logic based on whatever controller you're in. So that's obviously an important distinction to make. So we're going to now call the attach init, whoops, need my dot, to the attach init event, and we're going to call a function within which we create a text UI element that displays a hard-coded text string. And to do that, we are going to call new text control, and we're going to pass the text attribute, and we're just going to say, hi, my name is John, for example, but you can just put your own name in there. And once we've got that, we need to place at, I think we called it content, but let's go and check. So obviously we're creating our new text control and placing it at the content, which is the ID of our body here in the HTML file itself. So that's perfect. So we can go ahead and save, and let's have a look and see if our text, our hard-coded text, comes up. And to do that, we are going to use our UI5 CLI and type UI5 serve. Oops, UI5 serve rather. And that should run our little local server. Perfect. So let's go and take a look at our app. And we're going to run index.html. And here is our hard-coded text. Right, in step 2, we are going to move on to actually creating our model. And your model can come in a whole bunch of flavors. You can have it in JSON format, XML format, OData format. You also get something called a resource model, which sits in an I18N file, which in the case of UI5 is used to create text that can be easily translated across your UI. So you have quite a bit to work with. You also have two types of models. You have your client side and server side. So client side could be, in our case, it'll be a JSON format model that we will do one call for on the client side, and it'll load pretty much all of our data and make the entirety of that model available to us. Server-side model is something like OData, where you can get and post different information, but that the logic primarily happens on the server. So you would get, let's say, a subset of data when you initially load the app, make some changes to it, send it back to the server would perform some logic and then give you back some data to display to the user. So all of your hard work happens on the server side. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump into it, and I'll explain the core further on once we've actually added it in. So underneath the same init function that we've now got off the UI5 core, we are going to create a model, and then we're going to assign it to the core. So I'll explain that in a second, but let's just put some code down first. Create a JSON model from an object literal. And so we're just simply going to create a model like this. We create a variable called var model, and that is going to equal, before we do that, we need to bring in the JSON model module up here. So that's going to come from SAP/UI/model/JSON/JSON model, and we are going to bring that into our function here. And now that we have this JSON model here, we're just going to say new JSON model and open that up. And we are going to just have something called greeting text. And that's going to be this same text that we had here. And that's fine. So now that we have that model created, so now we have our JSON model object with this data inside of it, we now need to assign the model to the core itself. So let's assign the model object to the SAP UI5 core. And again, just like we did in the last step, sap.ui.getCore .set model, and now we pass in this model object. And so now that we've bound it to the core, the reason that the documentation does it this way is purely for simplicity. So what would happen here is, just like we talked about in the last step, if you were doing this from a view perspective, which is technically best practice, to have your business data for that specific view obviously bound to that view itself, you would do something like this: get view.set model, and you would pass in your model object like that. So in your production apps, this is what you'll have to set the model to that specific view, because the data in that model will most likely be relevant to that view only in most cases. So this and this are doing the same thing, except this model is now available pretty much anywhere in the application. But that being said, that is obviously not recommended and not best practice, because it's not sort of compartmentalizing things, you know, and things are not on a need-to-know basis, if that makes sense. So again, when it comes to best practice, we're not going to worry about that now. To stick with the SAP documentation, we're going to use this sap.ui.getCore, and we're going to set and get our model, etc., and do the binding using that method. So it's an important distinction to know, that this is purely for training purposes and not what you should be doing in a production app. I cannot stress that enough. So we're going to go ahead and save, and that's it. You'll see that in the application there's no change, because we're going to deal with that and start our binding in a step further on down the line. Right, now in step 3, we are going to create a property binding, and we're going to take the model from the previous step, step 2, and we're going to display that data in our text control. So let's go ahead and scroll down to our text control here, and we are going to remove all of this, and let's create a new comment that says display a text element whose text is derived from the model object, which is what we're going to be doing. And all we're doing now is, in this little text section here, we are going to replace this with curly brackets, and inside the curly brackets we are going to call our greeting text, and the greeting text is going to come from here. And the reason we can do that is because the model has been set and is available to us, and because we've set it in the on top of the core itself, it means we can effectively just call it straight away like this, which is fine for demo purposes, but will obviously change as we move along. So if I go ahead and save that, let's check if it is working. And if we refresh the page, right, something has gone wrong. Let's check the console. I think I have made a small spelling mistake, hence why it is not working. So if we go ahead and save that and jump back into our page, refresh, we can see we have the same text that we had before, and now it's pulling specifically from this model here. Now we move on to step 4, where we look at two-way data binding. And so what we're going to do is we are going to adjust our model to include a few more values and a bit more data. And what that data is going to do is, or what we're going to allow it to do, is to tie into a newly created view and a newly created control, including the like SAP M inputs, for example. And what we're going to do is we're going to bind them to certain parts of that control, so that when we interact with it on the front end, something happens on the client side that kind of illustrates what happens when data changes and how we can start controlling the user interface based on the model itself. So what we're going to do first is we're going to create a new view, and to do that we need to create a new folder underneath web app called view, and under there we need to create something called app, or a view called app rather, .view.xml, because we're using an XML view. Then under here I'm going to open up my MVC tag and call my view, and under here XML NS, and we're going to bring in our sap.m library. And now we're going to, if you've gone through the initial full walkthrough, which is another video on this channel, you'll see we would have only dealt with the sap.m library. Now we're going to use an alias, and we're going to add more libraries in. And to do that, we're going to go XMLNS, and we're going to give this an alias of form. And this is going to be from the sap.ui.layout.form library. Form. And then we're going to bring in our MVC artifacts as well. Oops, I forgot my equals sign. So now we call XMLNS MVC. So this is standard artifacts that we need to bring in to allow our view to work properly within the realms of UI5. And this is sap.ui.core.mvc. Perfect, so we can close off that. And let's just close off our MVC view as well. MVC view. Brilliant, so now that we've set up our view, let's go ahead and add our panel. Panel control rather. And now that we've got the panel here, we're going to assign the header text attribute to a value from our model, which will make sense shortly, but I'm going to add it in here so that we can refer to it in a second. And so in here we're going to call something called the panel header text, and the rest of the attributes are going to be class. Let's just shift that across. Whoops. And we're just going to call our standard UI5 class sap.ui. Oops, it's sap UI responsive. If I can spell properly, sap UI responsive. Margin. The width we're going to have as auto. So just standard attributes here. And I think that's fine, so we can close off our panel. Brilliant. So now that we have our panel, we are going to call the form from the form library. And so that, and to do that, we need to add the form alias first and call the simple form and give it an attribute of editable. And it's going to make sense in a minute, but let's just set this to true. So editable true, and we're just going to give it a layout of column layout. Brilliant. So this just decides whether it's editable or not, and also controls the sort of size of your controls. And this is just a type of layout, pretty straightforward. So let's just close off the simple form. Lovely. And now let's just straighten that. Okay, that's straight enough. Now within the simple form, we are going to have 3 labels and inputs. And the first one is going to be label with a text attribute of first name. Oops. First name. And we can close that off like that. Then next to the label, we want to add an input control, just like we would in a normal form. So input, and we're going to set the value of this input to pull directly from the model. And oops, that needs to be, the quotes need to be on the outside. And we're going to call the first name value from our model. And we can go ahead and close that off, but let's add a few more attributes. So the first one is value live update equals true. And so this allows the value to be updated in real time within the application itself. And we'll just set a width to 200 pixels. Fine. And now where we start to see the the two-way data binding come through is we set enabled, the attribute enabled, to let's put that in quotes, to enabled. Now this enabled value is also going to be in our model, and so when we toggle the eventually we're going to add a checkbox, and when we toggle that checkbox on and off, this value is going to change, and it's going to determine whether this entire input is enabled or not. So I'm going to just be a bit cheeky here and copy and paste the second one, and this is just going to be last name. So we're just adding another field here and add last name here, value live update true, etc, etc. Brilliant. And now we need to add one more, except now we're going to have a label. Whoops, just open that control properly. Label, and the text is going to equal enabled, so it's just going to be called that. Now we're going to add another control, the checkbox, and inside that checkbox we're going to add the attribute selected, and that is going to also be attached to be bound to our model from the enabled part of the model. Now if we close that off and save, let's just close that off, double check everything's fine, it looks good. So now that we've saved that, let's jump back into our index.js. Underneath our model, let's add a few more, or let's change it rather to include the first name. And that's going to be, let's just say Harry, but this can be whatever your name is. Next, we're going to have last name, and that is set to Hawk. I'm just going with the example here. And we're going to set enabled, and that's going to be set as a Boolean, which doesn't need quotes. And now we're going to add the panel header text and set that to data binding basics. And we're going to go ahead and save that. So according to our view, which we'll deal with in a second, we've got our first name, our last name, our panel header text. These are all from the model. And we've got our enabled value here, which is also bound to this part of these particular input controls. So we'll see that interaction in a minute. So now we need to remove this. So again, we've set our model to the core, so that's all fine. Now let's go ahead and display the XML view, which we called app.view, called app. And all we're going to do is set new. I almost forgot. We need to bring in the XML view module here so we can display that. So it's sap.ui.core.mvc. Oh, these need to be slashes. My apologies. sap.ui.core /core/mvc/xml view. And we need to bring that into our constructor here. And now at the bottom, we can go new XML view and oops, add our attributes here. And we're going to call our view name and set that to sap.ui.demo.db.view.app. And we are going to place at content, just like we did before in our HTML page. And let's go ahead and save that. Now let's see if it works. And if we refresh the page, right, we've seemed to have run into an issue. So let's have a look in our console. Okay, naming convention. So just like we did in the full walkthrough video, which will be linked in the description, in the index.html, we need to add something called data-sap-ui-resource roots. And there we need to add, we basically need to add a namespace where our root folder will come from, and to stick with the walkthrough so that when you download the code, it'll, obviously you can refer back to it. I'm going to use the sap.ui.demo.db, which is what they've used. And I've just copied it across to make sure I've matched it exactly. But when you call this namespace here, it's going to effectively pull you to this home folder. So if you watch the full walkthrough, that'll obviously be explained in more detail. But just so you know, that's something we need to add at this step, which we didn't in previous ones. So that means that this should now work, and it should access our view and then our view folder, which is here, and then our appview.xml. So let's just make sure that that's saved, and let's go back to our application and refresh. Fine, we've got another issue. Okay, it looks like we've got an XML issue, which will come up quite often when you're retyping out your own XML. which I'd recommend you do, just so you get used to things. So back to the code. If we have a look at our XML, that looks fine. Label form, simple form panel. There should be a quote symbol, a colon there. I think that was the issue. Let's refresh and see. There we go. So we've now got our model bound to these different input controls, and you can see enabled is set, which means that these inputs are active or enabled. Now if we had to untick that, they're no longer enabled, and that's because we bound them to the input control and the enabled attribute directly to the model. And so you can switch it back on and you can type again, which is a very, very useful concept and something that you will find you'll use in your production apps quite often to keep things very tidy. Now in step 5 or section 5, we are going to switch off two-way data binding and we're going to turn on one-way data binding. And all that means is if you set your model to be one-way, to have or use one-way data binding, it just means that when you pull that information from the source and into your model, that's it. The data is there and it's going to be displayed and dealt with in your app, and there will be no communication back to the actual source itself. So the flow of information happens one way. Two-way data binding, it can flow both ways. So in this case, we are going to just simply turn it off. So now that we have, so you would have your model here, and all we would do to set the binding, set whether it's one or two-way, the binding mode, whether it's one-way or two-way, is we would call our model, and we would call set default binding mode, and we would call binding mode. Oh, apologies, before we include binding mode, we need to bring it in as well, our module. So again, calling in SAP/UI/ oops, that should be in quotes, SAP UI model binding mode. So now we're bringing that in and bring it into our constructor here. Perfect. So now we can use it. So set O model, which is our model object here. Set default binding mode, and we pass it in binding mode one way. And we go ahead and save. And now if we go back into our application and refresh, we've switched it off, and so nothing happened. So you would obviously use this under certain circumstances, whatever they may be, but it's nice to know that if you have a model that you've set to two-way bound to include two-way binding, you can switch it off very, very easily depending on the functionality of your application at the time. Right, in step 6, we are going to look at resource models specifically. And in SAP UI5, a resource model is where we are going to store language-specific texts in a separate I18N file, which we then build a resource model on top of. And we do that so that we can translate texts back and forth fairly easily, depending on your locale with different files. So in the previous example, we stored things like our label texts here, and also our bits and pieces directly in the model. We're now going to replace those with our language specific texts from the I18N file. And obviously that is because the storing it in a resource model or resource bundle is a best practice for SAP, and the way we've done it is not necessarily best practice. And so depending on the locale, your labels and various texts on the UI will change, which is obviously very useful. So let's go ahead and get started. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to run into our index.js file, and we are going to create our resource model. So underneath our model here, we are going to create a new variable called O resource model. Oh, and before I forget, we need to bring in our resource model module up here. So this comes from SAP/UI/model/resource model. And we need to take that and pop it in here. Brilliant, so we can access that. So we've got our variable for our resource model, and that is going to be a new resource model. And we're going to reference the bundle name, and the bundle name is going to come from sap.ui.demo.db/i18n, and so we're going to create our i18n folder and eventually create our i18n.properties file. We'll do that shortly, but that's obviously where it's coming from. And the next thing we need to do is we need to add our supported locales. We just need to add the comma in there. Supported locales. And in here, we're going to have our default one. And we're going to have one for Germany or Deutsch. And we need to tell it to use the fallback locale as our default. Brilliant. So we've got our resource model here with our bundle, which will come from this i18n file under the i18n folder, and obviously the i18n file. We've got locale supported, a default one or blank, and then a German one, and we're telling it that the fallback locale must be the default one or the empty one. And now what we need to do is we need to assign this model to the call, sap.ui.getCall. So just like we did with the other one, .set model resource model, and now we're going to give it an alias of i18n. So we're passing in the model to the set model method, and we're passing in the alias, so we're going to call it, or in our XML, for example, we're going to use i18n as the name of this particular model. So that's all fine. And we're just going to turn off this default binding for now, so it sets it back to two ways. Brilliant, so that's sorted. Now let's create our i18n folder. So under web app, we are going to create an i18n folder, and under that we're going to create a file called i18n.properties. Brilliant, and now in here we're going to start off with our field labels, and we've got first name, and we'll set that to first name, name, last name, and we'll set that to last name, and enabled will be set to enabled. And we'll just add our screen title as well. Screen titles, panel header text, and that will be data binding basics. BASICS, yeah, basics. Brilliant. So here's our I18N file, and these are what we're going to use to reference to pull in these properly set titles. Now let's jump into let's save that first. Jump into our view, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find our panel header text up here, and instead of using the slash like we would do for a normal model, we're going to go I18N and greater than sign, and that is how you reference your resource bundle specifically. So this greater than symbol is specific to the I18N file, and so this will pull our panel header text and display data binding basics. And then let's change the rest of our labels. So this one will be I18N and first name, and we'll jump down to our next label here and set that to I18N last name, and at the bottom here we'll find our last label and set that to I18N, I think it was enabled. Let's just check. Yeah, enabled, last name, first name. Oops, and we've got I18N first name, I18N last name, and I18N enabled. So if we go ahead and save, these properties should now pull through correctly, and our form won't actually change, which we're expecting. So let's go have a look. Refresh the page. Right, it seems we have a small issue. Let's check the console. The resource model.js has failed to load, so let's go check our index.js file. I found the issue. It's resource/resource model. Sorry, I was missing this part over here. Let's save that and take another look and see. Here we go. We're back to normal. So data binding basics, first name, last name, and enabled, all coming from, and obviously I've turned the two-way binding back on again, all coming directly from our I18N file. Right, in step 7, which is optional, but we are going to go through it anyway, we're going to look at how the resource bundle can be used to display the different texts that we've got in our app view XML here, our XML view, so that when you, for example, open up your browser and let's say another browser like Firefox in German, with your default language being German, you can actually get these to change automatically by just effectively having a second I18N properties file. And so we are going to do that. And all that's going to happen is this resource model has got its supported locales here and its fallback locale here, but its supported one is going to be DE. And so we are then obviously going to reference the German language version. So to do that, we are going to create a new file under I18N, and we're going to call it I18N underscore DE.properties. And in here, we are going to add our field labels and our first name, which obviously needs to match the other one, is going to be voornaam, and last name is going to be nachname, Name, and enabled is going to be activert, A-K-T-I-V-I-E-R-T, and our screen title is going to be panel header text, and in German that would be called data binding Grundlagen. And we can go ahead and save that. So now we have this file available here, and this _de is going to be referenced over here. So let's go ahead and pop into the browser. And if we go ahead and refresh the page, you can see that, and this will obviously be browser dependent, but you can add whatever language you want. I've just included German here. And if you switch to German, instantly it changes, which can be incredibly useful when you're building apps across an organization that operates in multiple countries. So yeah, it's just as easy as specifying a new I18N properties file for your particular language. Now in step 8, we are going to look at our binding paths, and specifically we're going to look at accessing properties in a hierarchical or hierarchically structured model. And all that means is when we access this model here, which is true for our I18N properties, it's flat. So it's basically one level and you just access each attribute as you go along. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add some more data in the form of an address, but we're going to structure it in a way that means we have to go one level down the hierarchy structure. And when it comes to JSON models and OData models, it's almost always, the data you get back is almost always in some form of a hierarchical structure and organized in some sort of fashion, especially when it comes to header and item views and that sort of thing. So we are going to add some address details, and then we're going to display it in a separate panel underneath our current form. So let's go ahead and just under our section here, we're going to add, or just under our model, we're going to add an address, and the address object is going to have street, and we're just going to say, I don't know, 1 any lane. So you can just make this up as you go on, as you go along. City, Waldorf, however you pronounce it. Zip code 69190, and country, oops, Germany. So now that we've got this data in, you can see our initial structure looks like this. Then we hit our address, which goes one level down into our street, city, zip, country, etc., etc. Oh, and we need to just put a comma there. So this whole item is actually an object. So we go ahead and save that. Now we are going to lay this out in our where is it? Our app view. So now that we're in our app view, we are going to come to the end of our panel, and we're going to create another panel. And let's close that off, panel. And here we are going to add some stuff from our I18N file. So first we're going to give it a header text attribute, and that's going to come from our I18N file, greater than symbol, panel 2, header text. And let's go ahead and add that to both of our I18N files. So we're going to put this here, and that's going to be address details. And let's, while we're here, to make it more clear, call this panel 1 and go back to our view here and make sure we label this as panel 1 so it's clearly separated. And let's go ahead and add a few more. Oh, sorry, we forgot to add it to the German one as well. So the German one will be oops, it's 1D address details. Okay, we save that, back to our view. So now within our panel control, let's add a few more attributes. We're going to call the class SAP UI responsive margin all round, and we're going to set the width to auto. Perfect. Now underneath our panel, we need to add our next control, which is obviously specific to the panel, and it's called content. And let's just close that off. Brilliant. Now that we're in here, we need to bring in a new library from SAP, and that is called XMLS sap.ui.layout.form, and we're giving it okay, so we'll change this as well. So what we'll do is, because we are going to pull the we're going to pull from a different library, we're going to change this a little bit, and this is going to be called, so we're going to have this set as L for layout. And then our form, we're going to change the library to sap.ui.layout, .form, and let's just put that in quotes. Okay, so we've got our form coming from our layout form here, and then we've got our layout coming from our UI layout library here. So that's fine, we can save that. Now what we need to do, I need to change that to equals. So now that we're in our content, we're going to call our new layout library for this new control, and we are going to call the vertical layout. And let's just close this off. Oops. Perfect. So now within our vertical layout, we're going to add a label, and we're going to add the address details as well. So let's go ahead and add our label, and it's the label for the address, and the text is going to come from our I18N, and it's going to be the address. So let's go ahead and add this in, and that's just going to be address, and now we add it in the German one as well. And it's just ADRESSE. Perfect, so we can save that, back to our view. So we've got our label 4 and text there, and we just are going to add this at the end. So now we've closed off our label here, so it should now just say address, semicolon, and that's perfect. Now underneath that we are going, we're going to add a control called formatted I'm going to add a control called formatted text, and we are going to give that a class SAP UI small margin at the bottom. So we're going to have a small margin at the bottom, and we are going to have HTML text equals. So again, all of these attributes are just from the documentation. So when you look for in the SAP UI5 SDK, you'll find formatted text, and all of these attributes will be here. So you don't have to learn this from memory. You would find these and use these in different parts of your application. So HTML text is now going to be, whoops, close that off. We're going to reference our address section and our street. So just like we would have referenced up here first name, on the same level as first name is address, and then one level down is street. And it's so you can see we've, just like we find first name, we find address, and street is one level down. So we add that, and then we can add a line break here. And oops, I got that in the wrong spot. And we're going to call address zip code, and we're going to call what's that? We're going to call address city, another line break, and after that we are going to call country. And we're going to give this the ID of address to link it up. Oops. So obviously this label here is linking up with this ID here of this formatted text. And underneath that we've got width of, let's just say 200 pixels. Perfect. Close that off. And that's it. So now just underneath our first panel, second panel with its header text, content in a vertical layout with our label labeling this formatted text, which has all of our nested data from our model referenced through the address, and then obviously the street, zip, city, country, etc. Now if we go ahead and save that, let's see what it looks like. Alright, it seems there's an issue somewhere along the line, so let's check the console. Okay, it looks like an issue with our XML. Let's go back and check that. Okay, so vertical layout, fine, label, formatted text. Okay, so the issue is probably with these HTML line break items here. So for some reason, and you'll find this with the ampersand symbol as well, when you do expression binding, you need to express the less than symbol or the ampersand symbol in a slightly different way. So what we're going to have to do here is going to look like this. It's going to be and LT like that, and this is going to be ampersand GT, and all this stands for is the less than symbol, which is effectively that, and then this stands for the greater than symbol, GT. So every now and then within these sort of, when you do expression binding and this sort of thing, you will have to show these symbols like the ampersand and the greater and less than symbol a bit differently. So it looks complicated, but obviously once you get used to it, it's not too bad. It's just up to UI5 on how they interpret these particular things, so we're at their mercy, unfortunately. So that should fix it. Let's go and take a look and refresh. There we go. So it's working. So that was the problem. So now we have address details, our address here, 1 Any Lane, this in Waldorf in Germany. So now in section 9 or step 9, we are going to look at formatting values. And what we're going to do is in our application, we're going to have a little email link at the bottom here that automatically formats itself to send an email based on the user's first and last name. And obviously as you change that, so the email will change and it creates a bit of automation there. So to do that, we are going to need to use a formatter function, and we are going to add that in a controller for this app view. So we're going to have an app controller as well. And then we're going to add some more details to our i18n file. So let's go ahead and create our controller. And to do that, we need to create a new folder called controller in the web app folder. And we need to create a new controller file called app.controller.js. Lovely. And now we are going to call sap.ui.define. Oops. SAP.ui.define. And we're going to open that up. And we need to bring in 2 modules. The first one is our controller, SAP UI core MVC controller, and the second one is from the sap.m library, specifically called library, and that's sap/m/library. Now that we have that, we can call our constructor and add in the, let's just copy it so that it's correct, controller and library. Brilliant. Now we need to use strict as always, and as in any controller we are going to return controller.extend sap.ui.demo.db controller.app, referencing our controller. And now we can go ahead and create our formatter function, and we're going to call it format mail, and that's going to be a function that pulls in the s first name and s last name. And now we are going to get our resource bundle and save it as a variable. And so we're going to grab that by calling this .getView. So if you remember, we are now calling the this.getView getModel, but before we were calling the sap.ui.getCore. So obviously now we're doing a similar thing, but we're doing it view specific, because now we have a controller and a view with logic specific to that particular controller and view. Which is obviously best practice anyway. But we're not going to change anything else. We're going to get our model, which is i18n, and from that we're going to get resource bundle. Brilliant. Now that we have that, we are going to, for this format function, we're going to return mobile library. Oh, apologies, this should be mobile library, like that. And mobile library, and we're going to return URL helper dot normalize email, which is obviously from the mobile library API or URL helper API. And we are going to pass in the first name, and we're going to put a dot, and we're going to say, so obviously this is first name dot last name plus at example.com, but this could obviously be at sap.com or whatever your email address is. And now we're going to grab the O bundle, and we want to get the specific text for mail subject and first name, and we want to get the text for the mail body. O bundle get text mail body, and that's that. Oops, that goes down here. So we're going to return our mobile library with our URL helper, and we're going to normalize the email, passing in our email address built with the first name, last name at example.com, passing in the mail subject with the first name here, and we're getting the text specifically from the our little resource bundle. And whoops, forgot my dot there. And we've got get text for the mail body. So now we're passing in the mail body, and that's how we're putting the mail together effectively. So we can go ahead and save that. Now in our view, we need to reference our controller, and we do that by referencing the controller name and passing in the location, which is sap.ui.demo.db.controller.app, because it's our app controller. We can save that. And now if we scroll down, so just underneath our formatted text, we're going to add a new control called the link control, and it's going to have a attribute href, which will be the following. We'll have the parts, and we'll have first name, which we're now passing into, which we'll pass into the formatter. And obviously first name is now coming from our model, specifically the top layer or top level of our model. And we'll pass in last name. And we're going to reference the formatter, which is that formatter function in our controller, and that's going to be format mail, which is here. So that's our formatter. And once we've done that, the text attribute will be I18N send email. Now let's go ahead and update our I18N file and make sure that's saved. So under here, we're going to have our little email section, and we've got send email, which will be send email. And we've got the mail subject, which is going to equal hi. And we're passing in a parameter here. That's what this parameter is. So if you wanted to add another parameter, it would look like that. But we're going to have one parameter for now. and mail body equals how are you. We'll go ahead and save that, and we need to add that to our German one as well. Email. So let's just be a bit cheeky and copy this and replace the text. And email versenden. And this is going to be Hallo. And in German it is Wie geht's es dir? Brilliant. So that's all fine. Let's have a look and see if it's worked. Refresh the page. So it looks like we have run into another issue, F12 for the console. Right, it looks like another XML issue, which is probably my fault. Let's have a look. Everything looks fine. Apologies, I did not close off my link control. So let's have a look now and see if it works. Refresh the page. It seems there is another issue. Let's check the console again. Something's wrong with the normalize email of well, it's undefined, so it's not working. Let's go back and check that. Return mobile library URL helper apologies. That should be capitals. Let's save and refresh again. There we are. So now here's your send email link, and you can see at the bottom it's harryhawk@example.com, subject hi Harry, and body how are you. And then obviously you can click on that. I haven't got an email client set up on here, but if you were to click on that, your email client should automatically generate these bits and pieces. And yeah, there you are. Right, now in step 10, we are going to look at property formatting using the SAP standard data types. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a sales amount, and we're going to give it the currency code of euro. And instead of just displaying it as a standard number like you would in JSON, in JSON format, we're going to put a data type on top of it. And you have a whole stack of different data types which you can find in the SDK, but in this case we're going to use the data type currency, which comes from SAP UI model, I think it is. And all we're going to do is we are going to add the data to our JSON model, and we're going to adjust the XML to display and format it correctly. And it's as straightforward as that. So we can then use the data type to display pretty much anything from dates to currency to whatever the case may be. So let's go ahead and jump into our index.js file. And underneath our model that we've got here, we are going to add sales amount, and we're going to set that as 12345.6789, and we're going to set the currency code to euro and pop a comma there. Perfect. So all we've done in our model, added sales amount, which is this single value here, and the currency code of euro. So let's jump into our XML document, and we are going to add a new vertical layout section or vertical layout control. So underneath here, pop that in like that, close it off. Lovely. Now we are going to add a label control, and this is going to be label 4, and this is sales amount, Brilliant. And the text is going to be from our I18N file, and that's I18, oops, I18N, and sales amount, AMOUT, perfect. So let's go ahead and add that to our two files. Let's just, where's that? Here. Sales amount, and that's going to be, whoops, sales amount. And let's pop over to our German translation. And that is going to be Verkaufsmenge, which is Verkaufsmenge, and save that, perfect. So we don't need the controller. Oh, sorry, back to the view. Right, so now that we have that text in there, we can go ahead and just add that, close it off. And now we're going to add an input control and give it the description. And this is going to be also, this description is going to come from our model specifically. And that's going to be currency code. And we're going to set this to enabled. Oh, sorry, let me just set these out so you can see it better. And pop that down there. All right, enabled, yep. And we'll set this to /enabled, again pulling directly from our model, and we will give this an ID which we pull from here just to make sure that they match, and that is perfect. So now that we have that, we are now going to call the value attribute, and in here we are going to start dealing with our formatting. So we're going to call parts, open that up, and in here we're going to set the first path, which is going to be sales amount, and our second path is going to be currency code. Yes, that's correct. So this will make sense in a minute. So we've got our parts. Now we'll set the type, and we're going to pull this directly from the documentation, and it's sap.ui.model.type.currency. Brilliant. And we want to set the format options. Lovely. And we're going to say show measure, or don't show the measure rather. And then after we've got that, we're going to set our width. And that's going to be 200 pixels. Which is quite standard. So we'll make sure we close that off. So we've got our input with our description, pulling in from the currency code. It's enabled. So again, everything coming from the model. Our ID is sales amount, so that it's linked to this label up here. Then in the value, just like we've done before, we're going to bring in our parts, and we're referencing the path to our sales amount and currency code for the value specifically. We're giving it a type. So again, from the documentation, pulling the SAP UI model type currency, data type currency, and format options, we want to show the measure as false. So we don't want to show the measure, the actual measure here, which you'll see now in the front end. And then we close it off with the vertical layout. Go ahead and save. And we can go ahead and test. So let's open up our browser, go ahead and refresh. And there you are. So now you can see we've got 12,000 comma 345.68, rounded up with euro and our sales amount, all displayed nice and neatly. And there you go. Right, now in step 11, we are going to move on to validations using the standard UI5 message manager. And what that means is we are going to take our application, and if we type something in here that is not the correct format that we expect for the sales amount input, we want an error message or the block to sort of light up and display an error to the, not display like a pop-up, but for it to highlight this as a sort of, you haven't typed something in correctly. And in order to do that, what we need to do is create our view as a named object. Then we need to use sap.ui.getCore to register the object, this new view object, with the message manager itself. And we're then going to place it back in the DOM like we did before at content. So the code changes are fairly minimal, but then once we've attached it to the standard UI5 message manager, we can then use the standard UI5 validations for our particular data types. So to get started, we are going to display the XML view called app, and we're going to create an object called oView, and that's going to equal new, or we can actually just copy this directly across. So just like we did before, we're creating a new XML view referencing the view coming out of the view folder, and specifically the app view. And then here we just change this to oView.placeAtContent back in the DOM where it should be. And now in between, we need to register the view with the message manager. And to do that, we're going to call sap.ui.getCore get message manager, and we're going to call the register object method, and we're going to pass in the oView and set that to true. Brilliant. So now that we have our new view object, we've used sap.ui.getCore to get the message manager to register the object being the new view object that we've got. So now that's connected to the message manager, and we then place it back in the DOM in our content here in the HTML ID tag. So we can save that and let's test it out. So if we go ahead and refresh, now if we just type in any old number, everything seems fine. But if we try to type in anything else, enter valid currency amount. So back to this, and there you go. It's as easy as that. Right, in step 12, we are going to move on to aggregation binding using templates. And all that we're going to do is we're going to create a new JSON model with some product data. We're going to store it in a separate JSON file. We're going to then bring it in and create a model. And we are going to display that model with inside a list control. And we're going to use aggregation binding to allow the list to automatically create the object list items based on how many items there are in the actual model. So the list will become dynamic, and there will be as many lines as there will be, there are as many lines as there are inside the JSON model, which could change at any time. So the aggregation binding itself can be used in tables, lists, or whatever the case may be, and it obviously just displays data dynamically. And on top of that, we're also going to add another formatter as well, which we'll move on to shortly. But first things first, let's go ahead and bring in our new data, our new set of data rather. So under web app, we want to create a new folder called model, and underneath model, we're going to create a products.json file. And I'm pulling these directly from the documentation, which you can do as well, but you can put any data in here that you like. This is obviously just the example data for you to follow along with. So in here, we've got our products object, and we've got a list of products underneath with a bunch of attributes. So let's just format that. There we go. We can go ahead and save that. So now let's jump into our index.js file, and let's create our model. So to do that, we're going to just shove this down a bit, and we are going to, oops, that comment belongs to that. And here we are going to create a new variable called oProduct model, and that's going to equal a new JSON model. And notice we've now created a blank JSON model, whereas here our JSON model opens straight up to just some hard-coded data. Here we've created a blank JSON model, and we're now going to call a method known as load data. So oProduct model.load data, and now we're going to reference the location of our products.json file, because that's where we're going to load the information from. So model/products.json. So now we've loaded the data, and the final thing we need to do is set the model using sap.ui.getCore, and set model. And in here we're going to put oProduct model, and we're going to give it an alias of products. And obviously we can call this alias in our XML when we do the aggregation binding. So created a new blank model, loaded the data into our model from our new JSON data over here, and sap.ui.getCore, setting the model to the core so it's accessible everywhere. Again, remember, not best practice, just using it because the documentation uses it, and also because it's easier to run the examples. But obviously you would just this.getView.set and get model would be replaced there, and give it an alias of products. Lovely. Now let's jump into our view, and we're going to add another panel underneath where we're going to have our list below that. So here is our panel there. Let's add another one. Close that off. And under here we're going to have header text. And the header text, again, going to come from our i18n file, greater than symbol, panel number 3, header text. Oops, if I could spell. And let's go ahead and add that to our section, which is here. And where's our panel? And we're going to call this aggregation binding. And let's pop this into our German section as well. And this is also going to be aggregation binding, because maybe there's no direct translation. Who knows? And let's save that. Back to the view. So the next attribute we are going to add is the class. And we're going to set that to SAP UI responsive margin. And we're going to set the width to auto. Lovely. So that is our panel sorted. Now within our panel, we're going to add a list control. So we start off with list, and let's just close that off while we're here. Perfect. Now in list, we're going to have header text equals I18N and product list title. Let's go and pop that in our properties. So this is now under our, what do we call this? We'll call this product list, which is fine. And pop that under there. And we'll just say product list. And in our German translation, we'll just put product list title Artikeliste. There's my good German, my very good German there. So we'll go ahead and save those and save that. Lovely. Now let's add the items attribute. And so this is where we are going to bring in our aggregation part of this particular control. So in a list, it's under items. In a table, it'll be in a different place, slightly different, obviously, depending on which control you use. Check your documentation and you'll see where to add it. So in this case, under list, it's under items. And under here, we are going to reference our products model. And now, slightly different, we're going to reference products. So do you see how we reference the model? And before, when we just accessed our standard model, we just had our slash name, first name, etc., etc. Now, when it comes to aggregation binding, we have our products model with a greater than symbol, and then followed by the slash, and then obviously products. And products down here is up here. And in this products object is a list, one object, two object, three object, etc. So these are the items or objects that will be aggregated, and this is the object that we have called from the JSON model. So now that we have that, we can close that off, which is perfect. Now we need to add a new control called object list item, and we're going to give that a title. And so now once we're under here, each of these this object list item is now going to be repeated and automatically generated based on the data in our JSON model. So when we call the title, for example, it's going to be products, and without the greater than symbol, we're going to put product name. So now you can see it's just the greater than symbol, and the product name here is again coming from here. And that's how we start to reference it. So now it's going to pick this product name, next object list item, this product name, next, next, next. So so we set obviously the title there. And the next attribute is going to be the number. And the number is going to get just like we passed in with our data types, except now we're going to place it within the object list item, and it's going to just aggregate that. So we're going to call parts. And under here, we are going to set our paths. So path, and it's products unit price, yes, that's right. And we are going to set the second path to currency code. Bring in the currency code from the other model, the initial model that we've worked with. So we're combining the two there. So now that we have that, we then apply the type, and the type is sap.ui.model.type.currency. And format options, show measure, set to false. Lovely. So that is our number part sorted. Now we need to add the number unit, and that is going to come from, you guessed it, currency, oops, forgot my slash, currency code, and we can close that off. So now we've got our object list item with a title, which will be aggregated, our number, passing in our unit price and currency code from two different models, our type, which is currency, formatting the options saying don't show the measure, and then the currency code slapped on at the end. And again, these are all standard. Oops, what have I done wrong here? I forgot to close this off. My bad. Okay, well, let's close that off. I forgot. I forgot my equal symbol. So that's fine. Right, now we need to add the attributes. And let's just close attributes off. Brilliant. So underneath here, we're going to add object attribute and set the text to equal products quantity per unit, quantity per, did I get that right? Unit, quantity per unit. Yeah, that looks good. So let's just, oops, put that down so you guys can see it. So we've got our text there, our object attribute, and we can just close that off. And we're going to add another, another object attribute. Object attribute. And we're going to set the text, we're going to set the title to equal the stock value. Whoops. So again, jumping into our model, products, stock value. Brilliant. And then under that, we're going to set the text to equal, pulling it again. Obviously now we're going to use a formatter for the stock value, which will make sense in a minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reference it now, and then we'll go ahead and actually build the formatter in the controller. So let's again just pass in our bits and pieces, set our parts, and under here we're going to reference the path to products unit price. Next path, units in stock, products, units in stock, and finally we're going to reference the currency code. Oops, I should probably close these off so they don't break. Very important. And it's going to come from currency code. Lovely. So these are going to be passed into our formatter, which we're going to reference here. and it's going to be format stock value, and close that off. So we're referencing the format that we're going to now build in the controller, passing it in these three items, or values rather. So let's just make sure the XML looks fine. There might be an issue, but we'll come back to it. Now let's jump into our controller. And in our controller, we've got our first formatter here. And so underneath that, we are going to call the format stock value formatter. And in here, we're going to create our function. And we are going to then pass in the unit price stock level, and again these are just parameter names, but they'll be passed in order anyway. Currency code, and boom, let's open up our thing. I'm just going to close this so you guys can see what I'm doing. So now we are going to create a variable rather called s browser locale, and we again are going to use the sap.ui.get call, and from the call we're going to get the configuration, and we're going to get the language that the page or app is currently loaded in at. And then we're going to create a new variable called locale, and that's going to be, that's obviously going to be locale, so we need to bring in some new modules here. Very exciting. The first one is sap/ui/core/locale, and these will all make sense very shortly. Let me just bring them in, for now, and we'll go through it in a minute. The next one we're going to bring in is locale data, and we're going to bring in our currency type. So sap ui/core/locale data. Finally, escape sap/ui/model/type currency. Brilliant. So just like we did before, let's bring it into our constructor. Boom. Locale data. Sorry, I'm just copying it to make sure it matches at least. Whether or not it's correct is a whole nother story. Right, so we brought those in. Now we need to set a new locale, and that's going to be the browser locale. And we're going to create another variable called locale data. Locale data, perfect. And we're going to set this as new locale data, passing in our locale. Brilliant. And now that we have that, we're going to create another variable called currency, and we're going to set that as new currency locale data dot m data dot currency format. And we are going to return, so now we're going to obviously return the values, or the value rather, and we're going to format these particular values based on this currency that's been set up using our locale data, which has now come from our core, which is loaded up in a certain language. We're going to return the O currency format value And in here, we're going to put in the F unit price multiplied by the stock level, and we are going to pull in the currency code, bring it back in string format, set that there, and we can go ahead and save that. So we're bringing in, it's fairly long-winded, and once you read through it, it'll make sense, but we're using the core to grab a language. We're then grabbing our locale. We're then calling our locale. We're creating the locale data object based on our locale. We're then creating a new currency object based on the locale data that we've got. And then we're using that to format the value, which is the stock level multiplied by the unit price and the currency code, and we're returning it as a string. And you'll see what that looks like very shortly. And I think we've forgotten one thing. We forgot to add the stock value here. And this is current stock value. And in German, it's stock value. And this is a Lagerbestand Wert. Lagerbestand Wert. Sorry if I pronounced that terribly if you are German. Okay, so our format is running there. Back to our view. So now we've got our stock value, and we've now set it as passing in all of these different values, formatting it and returning it as is. And now we can go and see what all of this effort looks like in the front end. We refresh the page. All right, so there seem to be a few issues, but we can look at that now. So you can see we've got all of our lists based on our items. So let's just go back to our JSON. So we've got chai first, chang second, aniseed syrup. Chai, chang, aniseed syrup. So it's loading it correctly. We've got all our different values here, all aggregated nicely. It seems to be missing the currency code though. I'm not sure why, but let's just go and double check. Okay, so there could be an issue with the XML. Where is that? Here we go, number unit. So in our object list item, the number unit should be current. Oh, here's my spelling. I do apologize. Currency code. Let's go and see if that works. Brilliant. So here's our stock value though. It's missing our title. Let's go and see what the issue is there. Let's see, object attribute, text object attribute here. Title, apologies. Calling all these different models. That should be set to I18N. Let's refresh and have a look. There you go, stock value, ready to go. Right, now in step 13, we are going to move on to element binding. And element binding is exciting because when you have your list of items here, you can use element binding to allow you to click on an item, pass the data for this single item and display it in something like a form, which we're going to do in this example. So let's jump right in. And the first thing we're going to do is we are going to add a fourth panel to our view. And let's just close that off. And under here, oh, sorry, before we do that, let's just add a few attributes to our panel. The first one being the ID, which is going to be product details panel, product details panel. And let me just make this a bit wider so you can see. Then we're going to add the header text, text. And the header text, as always, is going to come from our i18n file. And it's going to be panel for header text. Perfect. So let's just go ahead and add that to our i18n. Where are panels? Here we are. And we're going to call this product details. Brilliant. And in German, that is going to be called product details. Where is it here? Panel 4. So there we are, product details. Lovely. Save, save, back to our view, and let's continue. So we want to set a class, and that's going to be SAP UI responsive margin, and we're going to set the width to auto. Lovely. Oops, that shouldn't be there. Now, under our panel, we are going to add a form, and we've already got the library pulled into our XML. So we call our alias form, simple form, and we can say this is editable by setting it to true. And we're going to set the layout to be a column layout. And again, you can visit the documentation to see the different layout options you have available to you. And I'm going to go ahead and close our simple form off. There we are. Now under here, we are going to add, I think it's about 6 labels. So let's add our first label, offering the text. And the text is going to be i18n product ID. And I'm just going to add these all first, and then we'll go back and change and add them to the i18n files. And then we're going to get our input control and set that to value. Oh, sorry, I need to just fix that. And we can just close that off. And this is going to come from our products model. And it's going to be product ID. Brilliant. So I'm going to be a bit cheeky, and I'm going to copy this down. And I'm going to change this. Once we've got product name, we need quantity per unit. Quantity per unit. Brilliant. Then we want unit price. Sorry, I know this is a bit laborious, but it's important to go through each individual item so you see how it works. Unit price. Then this is units in stock. Whoops. Brilliant. And finally, we're going to say whether or not it is discontinued, except in this case, it's a checkbox. Discontinued. Discontinued, yes. That is correct. And this is going to be a checkbox. Brilliant. So we've got our form laid out here with all of our different input values. Brilliant. So this should now be populated. Well, now we're going to get it to populate with the single values that we need. So we can make sure that's saved. Now let's jump into our... Before we do that, actually, we need to, underneath our first panel, our third panel, panel 3, we need to add underneath our third panel, underneath the object list item, we need to add 2 more values. And the first one is the press event. And we need to register an event called on, for example, on item selected. And we need to set the type to be active. And all that's going to do is when you press on this object list item, which is obviously now aggregated down based on the model, we're going to call this event in our controller. So let's go ahead and pull, well, we can just copy this as well. Jump into our controller, and underneath format stock value, let's add our event here. Pull in our function. And again, when dealing with a function, when dealing with an event like clicking on something or pressing on something, you need to pull in the event. So there'll be this object which we'll just call oEvent, which will hold all of the data we need and the what's known as the context of what we have just clicked, and we're going to use that to construct the data and fill our form in with that one single item. Lovely. So now that we're here, we are going to create the following variables. Selected item, and to get that we call the oEvent, and we call get source. Then we get another variable called context, where we get the context, and this is selected item dot get binding context, and that binding context is from our products. Then we need to get the path, and the path is the path to the single item that we have clicked, and it's going to give us the path specifically in the model of that single item. So we set that variable there. Context dot get path. And again, if this looks complicated, don't worry. Once you work through it step by step, it'll make a lot more sense. And steps like this will become very, very common when you do your master detail or list apps. This will become sort of very commonplace, and it'll sit in your memory. So now that we have the path, we've got product detail panel. So now we're getting our product detail panel, and we call this by this dot by ID. And remember, we set an ID. Where is it here? We set an ID for our panel. So now we can. I'm going to copy it here just so you know where it's coming from, and that it's also correct. And all we do is product detail panel bind element, and set the path s path from the model products. And so all we're doing here is we've now got our selected item, we've got the context. From the context we get the path of the exact path to the single item that we're looking for when we search for it in the model. We're then getting our new fourth panel that we've created, and then all we're doing is we're binding an element, giving it a path, and then in that bind element path, giving it the path and which model to apply that path to, and it should populate our data. So now let's go ahead and do our I18N properties, and I'm just going to copy it across from the documentation just for the sake of time. Do the German translation, save. So we've got our product ID, name, quantity per unit, unit price, number of units in stock, and discontinued, whether or not it's discontinued. And now that we have all of this here, let's see what happens. And let's refresh the page. And here's our nicely laid out new form in a columnar layout. So here's, you can see the sort of two columns it's done automatically. And now if we click on Chai, product ID 1, product name, quantity per unit, and whether or not it's discontinued. And it's as simple as that. Now, in step 14, we're going to move on to something that I personally find very, very, very useful in my day-to-day projects, and that's expression binding. And with the expression binding, what we're going to do is we're going to format these values here, the 18, 19, 10, etc., and we're going to compare them based on a value, and if they're greater than that value, we want to format them accordingly. And we can do that all within one single line of code. So let's jump in and get started. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go to our model. We can close that. And we need to find our model in our index.js file, and under here, under sales amount, we're going to put a value called price threshold. That's 1H, sorry, threshold, and we're going to set that to a value of 20. Now we're going to compare this value and format based on that. So now that we have that there, we're going to jump back into our view here, and we need to find our third panel. Where is it here? So under panel 3, underneath the object list item, we've got our number unit. We're going to add a new attribute called number state, and this obviously when you follow the documentation, you'll have different things can have states, and they can have something called error or success, or I think caution is one of them as well. But effectively we're looking for two states, error and success, and error will be will change the color of our number unit and basically all of our details to red, and success will change it to green. And we're going to put a shorthand JavaScript if statement in there to evaluate whether or not those values should be there. So I mean, it's actually quite brilliant how, when you see it written down, and you will use this quite a lot, I guarantee that. So when we use expression binding, the first thing we need to do is we need to get the value. So within here we put an equal sign, dollar, and from the model we get the products unit price, and we compare that. So if the product's unit price is greater than, again calling our second value, sorry, let me just make this wider, dollar symbol, open brackets, price threshold. So now we're getting the unit price from our products model, And then from our standard model that we had, we're just calling the price threshold, so you know where it's coming from. And so if this is greater than this, question mark, so now we're using the JavaScript shorthand, evaluate with the question mark, and if true, set the number state here to have error. So if you can imagine getting rid of all of this, all that would be left behind is the word error, which is one of the number states you can have. Or if it's false, so if this evaluates to false and it's actually the unit price is less than the price threshold, set it to success, which means that this number state will tell everything else to be green. And it's as easy as that. So when you read through it, the syntax looks a little complex. Don't worry, you just really have to worry about the equal sign and the dollar symbol to bring in your different values. Once you've got them, do your comparison, whatever that may be. And obviously this is just a basic version. If you look at the documentation, there is quite a wide range of things you can actually do here. Question mark to evaluate. If true, set it as error, which means it is greater than the price threshold. Or false, set it as success if the unit price is actually less than the price threshold. And now if we save, refresh, okay, let's check the console. I think there's a small issue. Right, it's something in the XML. I probably haven't closed off a tag somewhere. So number state, blah de blah. That's fine. What's the issue here? I think that was the problem. Let's save and check again. Okay, there seems to be another issue. Let's see. Okay, now that we're in the console, let's see, there seems to be an issue with the string, so let's go back and check the code. I think we might need to keep the space here just after success. Let's save and take a look. Now if we refresh, no, still an issue. Error, this should be a capital. My apologies, that should be a capital. Now if we refresh, there we are. So again, if these have evaluated to false because they are less than 20, which is that value we put in there, the threshold, so they're green. Above 20, it's set as error and changes the color to red. And you'll find this incredibly useful as you run through to quickly format bits of data as you go. Right, now in the final section, or step 15, we are going to use a factory function with our aggregation binding. And this as well is incredibly useful. In this particular example, we are going to call two different fragments. So we're going to take our object list items that have been aggregated, and when we apply a factory function, we're going to, in that factory function, determine whether or not we call a fragment that says here's our object list item with all the details, or based on a condition, for example, it being discontinued, set a slightly simpler object list item with a discontinued badge and obviously no information because it's not necessary. And so we're going to build that. So let's go ahead and dive straight into the code, and we need to create our two fragments first. So the first thing we're going to do is jump into our view. Where are we here? ITN, model, view. And underneath view, we're going to create our two fragments. The first one, product simple dot fragment dot XML, and inside here we are going to reference core fragment definition, And obviously, because this is a fragment, we reference it that way, and then we pass an XML NS, which is going to be our sap.m library, and XML NS for the core, obviously core being the alias, and sap.ui.core. Brilliant. So we've now pulled that in. Let's just close it off. Brilliant. Now under here, we are going to call a standard list item. If I could spell properly, standard list item with an ID of product simple, and then we're going to give it an icon, SAP icon, and the warning icon, and the title is going to be for the product name. So we're going to pull that from our model, products, product name, and we're going to add the products quantity per unit. Let's just close this so you can see quantity per unit, and we're going to pass in, or we're going to use the info attribute, and we are going to put in the discontinued value here from our I18N. Discontinued, and the info state is just going to be error, and let's just have this set the type as well as active. Info state, we don't need to put our brackets there. So info state, and when we press on it, obviously call our event we've set up in the controller for the item. And that is on item selected. Brilliant. And we can close off our standard list item like that. And we can go ahead and save. So let's go ahead and then and now add, so this is obviously the standard list item fragment for the item that is set as discontinued. Now let's add one where it is not discontinued, and we want to see all of the data. So we're going to call this product extended.fragment.xml. Lovely. And let's open up our fragment definition. And fragment definition, let's just close that off so that we don't forget. Brilliant. And yep, XML NS, bringing in the sap.m library, and XML NS alias core, bring in sap.ui.core. Fantastic. Whoops. And now for this, we're going to include the object list item, with allowing us to have a little bit more data. And this is going to have an ID of product extended, the title of products, product name, And just like we did before, oh, my apologies, just set that there. And now we need to call the products model again, quantity per unit. Fantastic. And now we set the number. We're going to run with our formatting here. So parts, and under here we will set our two paths. First path being product unit price. Whoops, we don't need that there. Products unit price. Lovely, comma, and the currency code. Currency code. Brilliant. And setting our currency type based on sap.ui.model.type. Currency. And our format options, and we're going to say show measure, or don't show measure rather, false, with an S. And now that we have that, we can set our type to active and our number unit to, you guessed it, the currency code. Lovely. And our press event on item selected. Close that off, grab that, and close this off completely. Brilliant. So now that we have our two fragments ready to go, where's our product simple? Our two fragments ready to go. Let's go ahead and call them in our app view. So let's just close this so you can see. So before we do anything, we need to bring in a new module, XML-NS. Calls, oh, not SML, XML. XML-NS core sap.ui.core. Lovely. Save. Now, underneath panel number 3, we're going to reference these. So we're in panel 3, and underneath our list, we can pretty much get rid of all of this except the list itself. And under list, we're going to set an ID of product list, and we're going to give the header text of I18N product list title, and we've already product list. Whoopsie, just is that correct? I18N product list title. Yeah, that's correct. And now, whoops, let's just close that off while we continue. And now we're going to set the items to equal path products model products, again referencing it using these two items here, and simply applying the, or simply calling the factory attribute because this is linked with the controller, product list factory method. Product list factory. Fantastic. And now that we have that, we need to add another control with the dependents. Dependents. So it's all these dependents. And we're going to add our fragments as dependents in this section, so we know what's what. And the first thing we do is call core fragment, and we give it the attribute fragment name. Oops, equals. Just close that off. And we reference the fragment name sap.ui.demo.view.product simple SIMPLE. Brilliant. And again, I'm going to be very cheeky and copy this. Oops. Can I do that? Yes, I can. And we'll just pop this back. And this is going to be product extended. Brilliant. So now that we have the two fragments that we need plus our bits and pieces here, we need to go ahead and build our factory factory method. So save, open the controller, and under here we are going to call a product list factory, and that's going to call a function passing in the SID and our context. And let's get to it. So we first create a variable UI control. Before we do anything else, let's bring in our modules that we will require for this section. And they are SAP/m/object attribute. And copy that into our constructor. Oh dear, this is getting quite long. Lovely. So now we've got our UI control variable. Now we need to decide based on the data that we get which dependent we need to clone. So, and again, this will make sense. So just ride with me as we go. For now, based on the data, which dependent to clone. And now we say if context dot get property units in stock equals 0, and context dot get property and we're going to get the property discontinued. And so if our units in stock is equal to 0 and our discontinued property is true, the item is discontinued, so use a standard list item, and to do that, OUI control equals this dot by ID product simple dot clone, clone, passing in the SID, else the item is available, so we will create an object lists item. And again, OUI, have I done that correctly? Oops. OUI control equals this dot by ID product extended dot clone dot clone SID. We don't need two of those. Clone SID, and that is you control by this ID. Now we're going to say, however, further if statement, if the item is temporarily out of stock, we need to add a status. So we will add a status. So if context dot get property units in stock is less than 1, OUI control dot add attribute add attribute, and we're going to add a new object attribute and it's going to have a text following the path of our I18N out of stock. And before we go anywhere else, we'll save and go and put this in our I18N file. Under here, out of stock. And the German for that is, I'm not sure what it is, so we'll just put out of stock as well. I'll just say, I don't know, nicht stock. Apologies for my German again, but this is just for demo purposes, so here we go ahead and save that. And once we have completed everything, so we're pulling out of our if statements. Where's our top one here? So we should now here return OUI control. Right, so now after all of that logic, and again there's a lot of it, let's see if it's actually worked. And so we should see two different list items, and we should have the out of stock attribute added if it's something that is out of stock. So let's check our application and refresh the page. Right, so we seem to have a small issue. Let's check the console. Error, no type for we need to specify a type for our fragments. There we go. So back in the code, if we jump into, where's our view, appview.xml. Aha. So we'll just close that. Here we need to define a type, XML. And let's get cheeky and copy that here. Brilliant. Let's see if that works. Oh, need to save and refresh the page. Right, it seems there's another issue. Let's check the console. Something's not right. So let's just take a look at our naming. There could be an issue there. So we're in app view where our products extended. Let's just check the name here. Extended dot should be fragment. My apologies. Product extended fragment, so we don't need to save. Let's go back and refresh. There we are. And so as you can see, our aggregation binding all looks good. We've got our out of stock item there. Everything's discontinued, but it seems there's an issue with the name here. So let's take a look back at the code and see what's wrong. Right, so it's probably a spelling mistake somewhere along the line. So let's see. Product name. Are those spelling mistakes again? It should be products. Let's just double check. Quantity per unit. Products. Let's go back and refresh. There we are. So now we have everything we need with our icon pulled in from our separate fragment, and obviously we've got our other fragment here, but if there's no stock, pull in the or add this attribute here, and there you go. Right, that concludes the data binding course or walkthrough alongside the SAP UI5 online documentation. If you managed to get this far, well done. We've managed to go into quite a bit of detail and covered a lot of interesting topics that I know will add value to your own development projects. So that's great if you made it all the way to the end. And of course, don't forget, if you would like to access any of the steps again directly or pull any of the code starting from a later step further on down the line, you can always go back to the GitHub repository, which is linked in the description, click on the commits and pull down the code from any of these different commits here if you want to start from a certain point. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment down below and I will answer them as best I can. Again, I always encourage you guys to read the documentation, keep the SDK close at hand whenever you are building stuff, follow your Fiori design guidelines, all that good stuff, and you'll come out with some really good stuff. So yeah, if you liked the video, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And as always, thanks for watching.